Target confirmed. It's the Imperial Navy battleship Yamato. All aircraft in attack formation. Search bombing run. Complete. Launch away.
December 16th, 1944. 7 warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy raced through the waters surrounding the Philippine Islands. Their destination is the American anchorage of San Jose on the island of Mindoro, a critical staging area for the U.S. forces now assaulting the Philippine island. Their goal is a simple one: enter the San Jose anchorage under the cover of darkness and rain shells and torpedoes on everything within their sights, before withdrawing as quickly as possible and avoiding retaliation by American forces. These were the basics of the operation drawn up to be the final thrust of the Imperial Navy against the American invasion of the Philippines, the place where the main force of Japan's Navy had met its end just months earlier. This was Operation Rei-Ichi-Go, the final victory of the Imperial Japanese Navy. During the Second World War, the Japanese Navy had quite a recognizable style of fighting at sea. Unlike most other countries which relied on such things as attritional submarine warfare to give them sea dominance, Japan opted for what was known to them as the Kantai-Kessen, a doctrine stating that Japan would win the naval war and utterly defeat their enemy in one single crushing engagement. This is what the Japanese had done to the Russians in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. In the final stages of the conflict, they managed to destroy what amounted to pretty much half of Russia's navy in the span of only 2 days. That engagement would come to be known as the Battle of Tsushima, and to Japan, it was the most glorious thing that had ever been done in the history of naval warfare. To be entirely honest, they weren't really wrong about that. Tsushima was a brilliant feat, but the Japanese reaction was to base their entire doctrine around winning a single naval battle, something that was not quite so brilliant. As a result of the faulty Kantai-Kessen doctrine, the Imperial Navy tended to suffer quite a lot during the Pacific War. Every time they tried to enact the Kantai-Kessen, they ended up putting months of planning and preparation into battles that would somehow only end up as catastrophic defeats, and would in every way reverse the outcome entirely. Instead of them completely decimating their enemy, their navy would be destroyed instead. As for why this always happens to them, I literally could not tell you. Anyone who has done even a bit of studying into the Pacific War could tell you that Japan did have a pretty good navy, and in smaller or even medium-sized engagements, they tended to perform incredibly well. The Dutch East Indies, for one, is a very good example of this. Just looking at this screenshot makes me wonder how the Allies managed to mess up as damn badly as this, because they did not do that at any other point during the war. However, although Japan won a few victories in the early war, it became a trend that as time went on and their navy got more and more depleted, they started winning less and less battles, to the point that by 1944, organized victories by the Imperial Navy were incredibly rare. For nearly 3 years of my life studying naval warfare, I never even had heard of a proper Japanese victory happening so late in the war. However, as all things do, this would eventually change. Around a month ago, I was sitting on my bed at around midnight, completely unable to fall asleep. It happens a lot that I just get distracted whilst trying to go to bed, and as such, I really just end up lying in my bed with my mind going absolutely haywire. This particular night, I decided that instead of trying to get a good night's sleep anymore, I was just going to get up and read something until the morning came. I got up, went downstairs, and after accidentally waking up my dog, I sat down on my couch and started thinking of something to read. I eventually decided to reread the Wikipedia page on the Japanese light cruiser Oyodo, which is a ship I've always been kind of fond of. I didn't really expect to see much stuff of interest here, and I was mostly just keen to read the paragraphs on the battle off Cape Engano, but this time, something caught my eye. It was a single paragraph that depicted a series of events sometime after the Battle of Leyte Gulf had already concluded, and it described an attack by Japanese cruisers and destroyers on the island of Mindoro. The paragraph was relatively short, but reading it struck me with a bigger sense of curiosity than I'd felt in a long time. Whatever had taken place that night off Mindoro really did look like an organized Japanese victory, one that had taken place in December of 1944, only around half a month before the beginning of 1945. I was intrigued to say the least at this point, and I immediately went to the Japanese Wikipedia page for Oyodo to see if I could learn even a little bit more. The Japanese Wikipedia didn't go into much more detail than the English one had, but it did contain one single thing of note. One single thing that enabled me to make this video and end up learning one of the most interesting stories I've ever heard about the Pacific War. These two words were a link to another article, an article titled Operation Rei-go. It could be said that the day the Japanese Navy truly met its end was October 26, 1944. It was on that day that the Battle of Leyte Gulf finally ended in a decisive American victory. In 3 days of hard fighting, the main elements of both the Japanese carrier and battle forces had been sunk or put out of action in a series of tangles with American carrier forces. The IJN survivors turned tail and ran away, with a lot of them never even attempting to meet the Americans in combat again. However, although the Imperial Navy was no longer capable of challenging the Americans in proper fleet action, its remaining light forces were still more than capable of harassing the enemy, and several smaller operations were quickly devised in order to further the defense of the Philippines. In a callback to Japanese strategy during the Solomons campaign, transports escorted by destroyers would make runs to the island of Leyte to deliver reinforcements as well as valuable food and supplies to the hard-pressed Japanese garrisons. Under the name of Operation Rei-go, these transport runs would end up resulting in the battles of Ormoc Bay. Along with this, serious consideration was given to using the nearly dead carrier fleet for kamikaze operations against the US, which, in the light of the rapid conversion of the aircraft carrier Shinano, didn't seem like such a far-fetched idea. However, considering the state of utter disrepair that the carrier fleet was in, that particular operation wasn't going to happen anytime soon, and in the interim, the combined fleet wanted something else. More specifically, they wanted a surface action. On paper, this would be an easy thing to get going, as outside of their battle fleet, a good chunk of Japanese surface vessels had come out intact out of the Leyte Gulf, and although a lot of them were damaged in one way or another, there were still plenty of combat units in good condition. The problem for the Japanese was not so much that the surface force didn't exist anymore, it was just that most of it had either already left the Philippines, or in the case of the destroyer force, was busy escorting cargo ships for Operation Rei-go. However, despite the lack of ships, plans were still drawn up for the surface action that the combined fleet wanted, and finding the target for it didn't take very long. Since the start of the American invasion of Mindoro, the San Jose anchorage became one of the US's most critical areas for the campaign, as it allowed easy resupplying for their forces on the island. Aerial reconnaissance had shown that the harbor was usually filled with both merchantmen and warships, both of which were susceptible to a surprise nighttime attack. All of these factors led to the development of what was undeniably an incredibly simple plan. Take a service force, have it make a run into the San Jose anchorage under the cover of darkness, and attack any ships present with gunfire and torpedoes before withdrawing back to safety. This was a tried and tested strategy that the Japanese Navy had been using almost since the beginning of their existence as a combat force. This particular plan was drafted into the formal name Operation Rei-go, which literally translates to Spirit Number 1. For those of you who are well versed in the naming of previous Japanese naval operations, that probably sounds kind of familiar. The concept of the Rei-go plan was so incredibly simple that it didn't really matter what ships were actually being used to execute it. At the end of the day, really any service ship in the Japanese arsenal was capable of getting the job done. As such, it is important to understand the predicament that the Japanese service fleet found themselves in after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese plan for Leyte Gulf involved them splitting their warships into 4 separate groups. The northern force contained what was left of the depleted Japanese carrier fleet, and as such was based almost entirely around its 4 aircraft carriers, with service ships being present only for anti-aircraft escort. The Japanese understood that their carrier fleet had fallen to such an extent that it was no longer capable of directly challenging the Americans, and as such, its only purpose in this operation was as bait to lure the American carriers away from the landing beaches that they were protecting. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, in charge of the Northern Force, was quoted as saying, I expected complete destruction of my fleet, but if Kurita's mission was carried out, that was all I wished. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita was in charge of the Japanese Center Force, which was undeniably the main striking force brought to bear during the battle. The ships present were the centerpiece of the Japanese battle fleet, with the two super battleships Yamato and Musashi sailing among its ranks. It was entirely a service force, and its only mission was to make its way to the Leyte landing beaches and destroy the American invasion force. As such, its mission relied heavily on the Northern Force being able to lure away the American carriers. Otherwise, they would be at the complete mercy of US air attacks. The Japanese Southern Force was effectively just a much weaker version of the Center Force. Led to battle by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, it was centered around the two old battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, escorted by the heavy cruiser Mogami and a detachment of destroyers. Its mission was exactly the same as the Center Force, and, like Kurita, Nishimura relied heavily on the Northern Force's ability to remove the American carriers from the area. Augmenting Nishimura's strength was the fourth and final Japanese force present at Leyte Gulf. The second striking force, under the command of Vice Admiral Shima, was the smallest of the Japanese forces, consisting only of 3 heavy cruisers and 4 destroyers. However, since its only purpose was to provide close cover for the Southern Force, its size did not need to be impressive. As a side note, you're also probably wondering why Shima's ships weren't just directly added to the roster for the Southern Force, and to be entirely honest, I have no clue why they weren't. During the actual battle, they ended up getting separated, and Shima didn't end up doing anything, really, so yeah, I don't know what was going on there. Apparently it was because Shima had beef with Nishimura or something, so he didn't want to be part of his force. My only source for that is a random comment thread on r/noncredibledefense, so yeah, take that with a grain of salt, but I really don't know why they just didn't combine them. Either way, the battle itself didn't end up going particularly well for the Japanese. The Northern Force did end up luring away the American carriers, but it suffered heavily for it. The carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and the destroyer Akizuki were sunk directly by air attacks, with the carrier Chiyoda later getting caught by American cruisers and sunk along with the destroyer Hatsuzuki in a fierce surface action. The final loss to the Northern Force was the light cruiser Tama, sunk by the submarine Jalao on the 25th of October. Down south, worse losses were awaiting the unfortunate Southern Force, which, in attempting to make its way through the Surigao Strait to the Leyte landing beaches, was confronted by a massive US battle force. Confronted by torpedoes on both sides and a US battle line crossing their T, the Southern Force was nearly destroyed down to a ship. The battleship Fuso was sunk early in the battle by destroyer torpedoes, whilst her sister Yamashiro pushed farther on only to receive a pounding by the US battleships before going down to similar weapons as her sister. The heavy cruiser Mogami found herself in a similar predicament, and although she managed to retreat from the battle with heavy damage, she was caught and sunk by US aircraft later the next day. 3 of Nishimura's 4 destroyers were sunk along with the Fuso by torpedo attack. This meant that the only survivor of the Southern Force was the lucky destroyer Shigure, which suffered no worse damage than a 14-inch shell from the battleship California, which passed right through the ship without detonating. The Center Force, being the largest of the Japanese fleets, was the most heavily engaged, and Kurita's ships suffered on and off contact with US forces for the entirety of 3 days. During the course of the first 2 days, the battleship Musashi was sunk by American air attack, along with the cruisers Atago and Maya, which fell to US submarines. The next day, on the 25th, the cruisers Chikuma, Chokai, and Suzuya were all sunk by US air attacks from some particularly angry escort carriers, along with the destroyer Nowaki, which, like the Chiyoda, was caught by a group of US cruisers and quickly sent to the bottom of the Philippine Trench. Rounding off the Center Force's involvement in the battle was an air attack on the 26th of October, which managed to put 2 torpedoes into the light cruiser Noshiro, sending her to the depths of the Sibuyan Sea. All in all, the Battle of Leyte Gulf ended up being one of the Japanese Navy's worst defeats in all of its history. Over the course of the 3 days, the Japanese lost 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers to all causes. These were staggering losses, but it didn't make it immediately obvious to the Japanese that their navy was now a non-factor. Confusing reports during the battle made it seem to the Japanese that the Americans had suffered almost as much as they had during the engagement, and as such, their naval forces were still relatively even. In actuality, this wasn't true at all. The Americans had in actuality taken only a fraction of the Japanese losses, losing the light carrier Princeton to air attacks, along with 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and debatably 2 destroyer escorts. Either way, it was still a bit of a morale boost for the now very depleted Japanese Navy that the US had suffered just as much as they had. This was the situation that the Japanese found themselves in whilst planning both the Tago and Rei-go operations, and in some ways, it was even worse. The surviving warships of the Center Force were needed to escort their battleships back to Japan, and the entirety of Kurita's fleet had withdrawn from the Philippines by the 16th of November. The Japanese weren't left much to work with after this point. With the withdrawal of the Center Force, Japanese service ships had to be gathered up from wherever they could get them. The remaining service ships of the Northern Force were immediately taken in hand for transport runs to the Philippines, including their only remaining heavy units, the battle carriers Ise and Hyuga. However, in terms of service ships, there was one Japanese force that was still almost entirely intact. The 2nd Striking Force, commanded by Admiral Shima, had arrived late to the Battle of Surigao Strait, and by the time they got there, they were greeted by a grisly sight. The Southern Force was in full disarray and was retreating from the strait in full panic. Shima was going to have none of it. Seeing the destroyer Shigure retreating from the strait, Shima assumed that the US forces were overwhelming and that this was the best time to turn his ships around and beat a hasty retreat. After an abortive attack on a radar contact that turned out to be an island, Shima withdrew from the strait. Having seen almost no action, the 2nd Striking Force was left virtually undamaged, with the exception of the heavy cruiser Nachi, which had managed to collide with the heavily damaged Mosgami while trying to escape. As such, by the time they got back to Brunei Bay after the battle, Shima's force was pretty much intact, beside the Nachi, and either way, repair work began on her almost the moment they arrived. As such, these ships were essentially the best candidate for Operation Rei-go. However, none of this meant that setbacks didn't continue to be suffered. The unfortunate Nachi, whilst under repairs in Manila, was set upon by US carrier aircraft on the 5th of November. Admiral Shima was ashore for a conference at the time of attack, but he arrived back at the anchorage just in time to watch his flagship be blown apart. Torpedo bombers from the carrier Lexington struck Nachi almost simultaneously with 5 torpedoes, blowing off her bow and detonating her after magazine, which severed her stern. Engulfed by the massive explosions, the cruiser sank in a matter of minutes to the bottom of Manila Bay. Just like that, one of Japan's most impressive cruisers was sent to the bottom like a toy boat. More setbacks continued to follow. On the 11th of November, Task Force 38 launched strikes against 2 of the Operation Tago convoys. The US air attacks crippled the convoy's merchant force, and, more importantly for the Japanese, 4 modern destroyers, including the powerful Shimakaze, succumbed to the aerial onslaught. The situation was fast becoming desperate. On the morning of December 16th, the Japanese High Command ordered what was essentially a preliminary version of the Rei-go operation, with the orders being for a purely destroyer assault on the San Jose anchorage. However, the operation was delayed from taking place long enough for it to be reconsidered. Perhaps, instead of a small-scale destroyer operation, this attack could be much bigger. In the following days, High Command ordered preparations to be made for a large-scale air attack on both the San Jose harbor as well as adjacent airfields on Mindoro, aiming to disable US air power in the area. Capitalizing on this opportunity, the Navy would dispatch a cruiser and destroyer force to raid San Jose harbor under the cover of darkness. On December 20th, Admiral Shima was ordered to assemble a cruiser and destroyer force for Operation Rei-go. Consisting of multiple cruisers and anywhere from 4 to 6 destroyers, this force was intended to raid San Jose on the 22nd, or if possible, maybe a little bit later. Remaining Japanese naval units were assembled in Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam to prepare for the attack. Vice Admiral Masafuku Kimura, flying his flag from the light cruiser Oyodo, assumed command of the Rei force. From there, multiple different warships were scrounged up to take part in the operation. Shima's flagship, the cruiser Ashigara, was donated for Operation Rei by Admiral Shima, who instead transferred his flag to the battleship Hyuga. In addition, the destroyers Kiyoshima and Asashima were put under Kimura's command, along with the Momi-class destroyer escorts Kaya, Tsuji, and Kashi. The first two had been part of Kurita's center force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but both had been detached early on and missed the greater portion of the action. As a direct result, they were still present in the Philippine area and were available for combat. However, this was essentially the extent of available warships that could be used for the operation, and the Japanese would have to make them count. A few days before the beginning of the operation, Admiral Kimura switched his flag from the cruiser Oyoto to the destroyer Kasumi, citing the fact that he'd rather operate from a ship a little bit more maneuverable than any of the cruisers were. In addition, both Oyoto and Ashigara were considered to be borrowed ships, since both had been separately detached from different forces in order to take part in the operation. On the evening of 22nd of December, Kimura's ships assembled in Camaran Bay. The attack on Mindoro was originally planned to be carried out on the 25th, but issues with the weather forced a delay, and the original date was scrapped in favor of an attack on the 26th. December 24th, 1944. The Rei-go force departed from Camaran Bay in Vietnam. The operation had officially begun. Leading the charge was the heavy cruiser Ashigara. The largest ship in the task force, she was a heavy cruiser of the Myokyo class, whose combat record dated all the way back to actions in the Dutch East Indies. Mounted on her deck was a powerful array of weaponry. Her main armament consisted of 10 8-inch guns mounted in 5 twin turrets, backed up by an array of secondary 5-inch guns. However, the most deadly weapon that she carried was a battery of 12 24-inch torpedo tubes, each one capable of sinking a warship with a well-placed hit. Accompanying her was the light cruiser Oyoto, a ship that had been commissioned relatively recently in 1943, and whose first action had come only months earlier as part of the Northern Carrier Force at Leyte Gulf. She was much smaller than Ashigara and carried considerably less weaponry. Originally designed to carry floatplanes, her entire aft section was devoid of any armament, instead featuring a prominent hangar that was originally meant to store her aircraft. Due mostly to this, Oyoto's armament was comparatively small. She carried 9 6-inch guns and triple mountings on her forward deck, along with a small array of dual-purpose 3.9-inch weapons. Due to the space taken up by her hangar deck, Oyoto carried no torpedo tubes, and in a gunfight would be forced to rely purely on her main battery. These two warships formed the nucleus of the task group, and were the largest combat units afforded to Operation Rei. However, despite their strengths, Admiral Kimura chose to fly his flag aboard one of the task force's 5 destroyers. Kiyoshimo, Asashimo, Kaya, Tsuji, Kashi, and Kimura's pick, Kasumi. Although small, the destroyers would likely end up being the most effective part of the Japanese force in a surface action, as they all carried a powerful battery of Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, one of which, like said earlier, was capable of sinking a warship with a well-placed hit. All 6 were battle-hardened and were expected to perform well in almost any situation. After first setting sail, the Rei-go force had initially steered a course not for San Jose, but instead for Manila Bay on the island of Luzon. The reason for this was to prevent American forces from figuring out what their actual target was until the last minute. They would spend the entirety of the 25th sailing on the decoy course, and would only change their heading by the night of the 26th, the same day that they were supposed to attack. It was a tried and true method used by the Japanese since the early days of the war, and it seemed likely that it would work again. In reality, the Americans had long gotten wise to the Japanese, and the use of decoy routes was now something expected of the Japanese by most American commanders. However, this time, the Japanese would get lucky. Throughout all of the 24th and 25th, the Japanese managed by pure dumb luck to remain undetected. As a result, the 26th of December found the Japanese in a very favorable position to begin the attack. They were right on schedule. In the early hours of the 26th, the Japanese changed course south-southeast, heading straight for Mindoro. At 11:37, Kimura received a report from Japanese High Command. As a result of aerial reconnaissance, it appears that there are few enemy ships in the Mindoro area, and the situation likely will not change for the next few days. Therefore, it is advisable to proceed with the operation as planned. For the Japanese, this was bad news. The lack of ships reported in San Jose meant that there would be way less targets for the Japanese. The San Jose anchorage was generally filled by a mix of merchant and troop ships there to aid in the Allied war effort. These were slow, vulnerable, and most importantly, valuable targets for the Japanese, and if few were reported to be in the area, there would be much less to gain in the attack. No matter what the situation was going to be in San Jose that night, the Japanese had come too far not to at least press the attack. Based on the given information, Admiral Kimura sent a signal throughout the formation. The Rei force will continue as scheduled. Each unit will be on high alert to prevent any surprise attacks by the enemy and will aim to achieve the objective of the operation. They were continuing exactly as planned. By 4:04 p.m., the Rei-Go force had drawn close enough to Mindoro that submarine attack was a real threat. Ashigara, being the only ship currently equipped with aircraft, launched 2 floatplanes for anti-submarine patrol. If a US submarine found its way into an attacking position, the Japanese would hopefully find out. However, the real threat to the Japanese was not one that was lurking underneath the waves, but rather was at this minute flying just below the clouds. 20 minutes after Ashigara had sent her floatplanes aloft, an American B-24 flying from Mindoro came into contact with the Japanese. It was too far away to be dealt with by AA fire, and there was nothing the Japanese could do to stop it from reporting their position. They had to accept that if the B-24 told Mindoro about their presence, which let's be honest, there was no chance that it wouldn't, they probably would come under some form of counter. Fortunately for the Japanese, they wouldn't have to wait long to figure out what was happening. The B-24 started broadcasting a sighting report almost immediately, and the message was intercepted by Ashigara a few minutes later. It read 12 degrees, 48 minutes north, 119 degrees, 12 minutes east. 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, 6 destroyers. Course 90 degrees, speed 28 knots. It was an impressively accurate report considering the time it took to be sent out. Although it appeared that the B-24 had confused Ashigara for a battleship due to the size difference between her and Oyoto. Either way, the Americans now knew that they were coming, and the Japanese could do nothing but grit their teeth and hope for the best. Admiral Kimura, for his part, remained completely unfazed by the spotting report. Soon after being spotted, he sent a telegram back to High Command, reading simply, "We are entering as planned." The message from the B-24 quickly reached Allied Command on Mindoro Island, and the American reaction came quickly. The reported course given by the B-24 made it clear that there was only one thing the Japanese could be going after: the San Jose anchorage. There was relatively little there at the time that the Japanese could go after. A few transport ships were currently anchored there, and they were guarded by 10 PT boats, which, although small, would not be particularly happy about a Japanese intrusion. Each boat carried around 4 torpedoes, and they would be more than happy to use them. Even so, it was still preferable to not have vulnerable transport ships be blown up by long-lance torpedoes, and the US was going to do everything in their power to prevent that from happening. At this stage in the operation, the best thing the US could do was to launch an aerial strike against the Japanese forces, and this was quickly ordered. However, the US Air Force present on Mindoro had only been recently established, and they lacked sufficient weapon stockpiles for a large-scale attack. Namely, no torpedoes were available, and aircraft would have to rely only on bombs to sink the Japanese warships. Available US aircraft quickly began arming themselves for a strike, whilst P-38 Lightning fighters were dispatched to monitor the Japanese formation and prevent a loss of contact. However, even if everything went to plan, an air attack would be the least of Japanese concern. In addition to the forces already present on Mindoro, an order went out for the US 7th Fleet to dispatch a cruiser and destroyer force to engage the Japanese. Dispatched from the 7th Fleet were the heavy cruisers Louisville, Minneapolis, and the light cruisers Phoenix and Boise, all veteran fighters of the US Navy, and more than a match for their Japanese counterparts. Escorting them was what currently remained of the 56th Destroyer Division. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, these destroyers had charged down the ships of the Japanese Southern Force, assisting with the destruction of the battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, and helping to rout the Japanese force. However, during the battle, one of their number, the Albert W. Grant, had ended up on the receiving end of the Japanese guns. Secondary battery fire from Yamashiro, coupled with friendly fire from US cruisers, had left the little destroyer crippled and dead in the water by the battle's end. She survived the engagement, but the 8 other destroyers of her division were no doubt looking for a chance to get even with the Japanese. And now that the Rei-Go force had been detected, that opportunity came right to them. At 6:39 p.m., the sun went down over the Japanese force. This would ordinarily be a good thing for the Japanese, but on this particular night, it wasn't. Luck had finally failed the Japanese formation, and tonight they were sailing on water brightly illuminated by a moon that was nearly full. The Americans could hardly have asked for a better view for an airstrike. At this point, it was only a matter of time before the Japanese would be attacked. For a full 2 hours after the sun went down, crewmen aboard the Japanese ships waited anxiously for something to happen. Crewmen on the somewhat useless 25mm AA guns waited in silence for any sign of an American aircraft. The moment one came within range, they were determined to strike it out of the sky before it reached their ship. Considering American air supremacy at this point in the war, it was a foolish hope. No matter what the odds were, the Japanese gunners would soon get their chance. At 8:42, the first sign of the enemy was seen. A lone American aircraft was spotted at long range, and the Japanese prepared to engage. It was a lone B-24 attempting a bombing attack. With long-range AA bursts exploding around it, the American pilot fixed his bomb sights on the Asashimo. With the precision of a hawk, the B-24 dropped its payload dead on target. Maneuvering hard to avoid the spread, Asashimo was rocked by explosions coming from all sides. Shrapnel from the bombs exploded on the ocean's surface before whizzing toward the destroyer at nearly 1,000 feet per second. Crewmen on deck took cover behind anything they could find to avoid the deadly spray. Bulkheads and gun shields were hit hard by the splinters, but when the dust had cleared and the action was over, not a single shard had made contact with human flesh. Asashimo resumed formation, with very little damage, and her crew members somewhat shaken, but still alert. The B-24 that bombed Asashimo was not likely to be out by itself, and the Japanese surmised as much. Having witnessed the attack on Asashimo, the other ships in the formation were as alert as they could be. Hundreds of eyes were now scanning the sky in search of enemy planes. It wouldn't be long until they spotted them. At 9:01 p.m., the full American wave came into view. Multiple B-24s and P-38s came into the gunnery range of the Japanese ships, and the attack began. The Japanese destroyers began throwing 5-inch shells into the sky in an attempt to destroy the bombers. Although aided by main battery fire from Oyoto and Ashigara, the bombardment fails to have any appreciable effect. Oyoto is the first ship to be attacked. At 9:01, 500-pound bombs dropped by the B-24s rained down around the Japanese cruiser. Despite her best efforts, the American planes get the better of her. 2 500-pound bombs make contact with the Japanese ship. The first is a glancing blow. One of the bombs hits the side of Oyoto's bridge wing. Failing to detonate on the thin steel, the bomb plunges straight through and detonates harmlessly in the ocean. The second bomb was a well-placed hit amidships. The 500-pound bomb landed right on top of Oyoto's engine room. Punching through her deck like it wasn't there, the bomb nearly made its way into her engine room. However, Oyoto's luck held. The bomb failed to enter the engine room, and on top of that, even failed to detonate. Despite the good aim by the B-24s, Oyoto emerged undamaged. The bombers had so far failed to cause any appreciable harm, but this was soon to change. At 9:15, the destroyer Kiyoshima finds herself the target of the attack. Just like before, multiple 500-pound bombs are dropped on the destroyer. Kiyoshima swings herself into evasive maneuvers, hoping that just like before, she would be able to avoid any damage. It would do her no good. Moments into her turn, sailors aboard the destroyer are jarred by a massive explosion. A 500-pound bomb impacts Kiyoshima amidships around her second smokestack, penetrating straight through her deck and detonating in her engine room. The number 3 boiler and port engine rooms were engulfed in a hail of shrapnel. Almost all crew members present were killed, and the engine room was knocked out of action. Her remaining propulsion systems, although out of the direct area of the blast, are heavily damaged by shrapnel, and fires broke out in her engine and number 2 boiler rooms, causing heavy black smoke to belch out of her smokestack. The force of the explosion causes vibrations to run throughout the ship, and moments later, the number 1 boiler room and starboard engine rooms fail. With the last of her propulsion systems offline, she was left dead in the water. This was the worst possible damage that she could have received. A single 500-pound bomb had somehow managed to destroy her ability to move, and on top of that, she was flooding fast. A large hole had been ripped open in her port side near the waterline, letting in copious amounts of water every second that it remained unchecked. Damage control teams rush about the crippled ship, playing water over her fires and shoring up bulkheads to prevent more flooding. Although their efforts succeed in some departments, there is no stopping her flooding, and the ship takes on a list to port. Kiyoshimo's commander, Captain Kajimoto, is rightfully in shock that his ship was put out of action so easily. The 500-pound bomb had been placed too precisely, and had caused such catastrophic damage that at first, he mistook it for a torpedo fired by a PT boat. In his opinion, surely nothing else was capable of doing such catastrophic damage. The stricken Kiyoshima was quickly foundering, but she had to be left to her own devices. The rest of the Rei force was still under heavy attack. B-24s continued to make passes over the Japanese ships, whilst P-38s resorted to strafing attacks to take out anti-aircraft gunners. However, the Japanese were slowly starting to exact some revenge. At 9:20, just 5 minutes after Kiyoshima was hit, the Japanese drew their first kill. A 5-inch salvo from the Kaya caught a B-24 mid-air, causing it to spiral out of control down into the sea. It was hardly compensation for Kiyoshima's damage. 4 minutes later, the American plane struck again. A well-placed 500-pound bomb from a B-24 slammed into Ashigara amidships. The resulting explosion tore her deck into fragments, and a large fire was started. She was in serious peril. Should the fire reach her torpedo magazine, the resulting explosion would inevitably leave her in a worse condition than even Kiyoshima was in. At the Battle of Midway 2 years earlier, the cruiser Mikuma had had a similar detonation take place on board, and she could not have been saved. Damage control rushed to contain the flames as an order was barked out for Ashigara to jettison her torpedoes, and all available men quickly rushed to contain the fire. With damage control teams in charge of keeping the fire from spreading, Ashigara resumed formation. At the same time that Ashigara was struck, the destroyer Kaya found herself on the receiving end of an unexpected kind of attack. AA gunners throughout the Japanese formation had been constantly spitting flak at the Americans almost since the battle had started, and the level of AAA that they were putting skyward had not decreased. Even the damaged Kiyoshima was still spitting 5-inch shells skyward with her guns under manual control. An unlucky P-38 ended up on the receiving end of this barrage. Flying over the formation looking for strafing targets, the aircraft received multiple hits from Japanese AA and began nosing downward. The pilot, determined to sell his life dearly, used what control he still had to aim his plane at the Kaya. He nearly hit his target. Sailors on board the destroyer watched as the P-38 zoomed straight at their ship, with the same deadly determination as their own kamikaze attacks. With 50 caliber slugs raking the deck of the destroyer, the P-38 drew closer. Gunners aboard the Japanese ship ducked for cover as the P-38 whizzed just over their heads. Barely clipping her number 2 smokestack, the aircraft crashed into the sea mere yards away from the destroyer, which emerged nearly unscathed and continued fighting. At this point, the Japanese were finally starting to get the better of the American planes. So far, 2 aircraft had been down by the Japanese, and those that were left no longer had any ordnance left to attack with. It was not worth it anymore to continue the attack. Japanese AA fire had never let up, and every minute that they remained, they were at more and more risk of being shot down. After the suicide attack on Kaya, the Americans elected to withdraw. Japanese 5, 6, and 8-inch shells continued to chase the American aircraft, with even the crippled Kiyoshima still putting her fair share of ordnance into the sky. The attack was over, and the Japanese now had time to assess the damage. The fire that had started on Ashigara was now under control, and since she had jettisoned her torpedoes, there was no longer any danger of a catastrophic explosion. Kaya had taken mild strafing damage from the P-38, but was otherwise perfectly functional, as was the Oyoto, who had suffered no more after the 2 dud bomb hits. The same could not be said for the crippled Kiyoshima. At this point, there was almost no hope of restoring power to the ship, and progressive flooding was starting to get the better of her. She now lay on the water as more of a useless hulk than an actual warship. The Japanese were now free to continue the operation as previously planned. The air attack was a setback to be sure, and of course the loss of Kiyoshima was incredibly regrettable. But the rest of the Japanese warships were still operational, and the success of Operation Rei-go was not far from their grasp. As such, Kimura elected to continue the operation as previously planned. The ships of the Rei-go force reorganized themselves into proper formation and continued to steam onward toward their target. As for Kiyoshima, there was nothing they could do for her, and she was left burning on the ocean's surface. December 26, 1944, 10:10 p.m. The remaining operational ships of the Rei-go force had now steamed onward for nearly 2 hours after the air attack, and were fastly closing in on their objective. Since the conclusion of the air attack, there had been nothing done to disturb the Japanese advance, and every minute they were getting closer and closer to San Jose. At 10:10 p.m., the Japanese witnessed the first sign that they were getting close to their target. Some eagle-eyed lookouts in the Japanese formation spotted multiple US PT boats closing in on their formation. Almost immediately, the Japanese ships began to react. The destroyers, with their small gun mounts, quickly trained on the small craft and opened fire, followed minutes later by Oyoto and Ashigara. 5, 6, and 8-inch shells rained down around the PT boats, covering the sea in a hail of fire and shrapnel. PT boats had seen success in engagements earlier in the war, but this attack was eventually judged to be hardly worth it. After a few minutes, the Japanese witnessed their assailants turning tail and fleeing from their gunfire. One of the boats was observed to be burning. If any torpedoes were fired, none of them made contact, and the Japanese continued onward unscathed. By this point, the Japanese were nearing their objective. Just like before, they were still advancing on schedule. After the torpedo boat attack, the Rei-go force continued advancing steadily, drawing closer to San Jose every minute. No more American attacks materialized, and all was calm. Aboard the cruisers Ashigara and Oyoto, preparations were being made to begin the attack. Being the largest and most heavily armed vessels in the formation, the two cruisers were expected to spearhead the attack, and they needed to be ready. On Ashigara, star shells were being loaded into the 8-inch gun breeches in preparation for the assault, whilst nearby, the same thing was happening on Oyoto. At 11:04 p.m., the force finally entered San Jose. Everything that the Rei force had done so far had led up to this moment. They couldn't waste it. The 8 and 6-inch guns of the two Japanese cruisers erupted into smoke and flame, hurling star shells hundreds of feet into the air in the direction of the anchorage. The shells raced through the sky, whizzing over the anchorage at hundreds of feet per second, leaving an eerie calm over the Japanese warships. It wouldn't last long. Nosing down over the bay, the projectiles suddenly erupted into clouds of smoke and flame, hanging hundreds of feet above the water like miniature suns. Every single object present in the bay was now visible to the Japanese. Lookouts aboard the cruisers scouted the bay for signs of the enemy. From what they could see, there weren't many ships in San Jose that night, but that didn't mean that the anchorage was empty. Multiple cargo ships were spotted in the harbor. Caught by surprise and with very little in the way of defense, they were perfect targets. The order went out to the Japanese warships to begin the attack. 7 minutes after the first star shells were fired, the Japanese began to fire. Oyoto and Ashigara began raining fire on pretty much any target that looked mildly hostile, whilst the destroyers began a torpedo attack on the anchored transport ships. Their efforts were hampered by the fact that the ships couldn't actually enter the bay, which was both too small for proper formation sailing, and was also within range of shore-based American artillery. The Japanese destroyers launched their torpedo attack from outside of the bay, doing their best to ensure hits with their torpedo salvo. Kasumi fired first, launching 4 torpedoes at the American transports. A few minutes later, observers aboard the destroyer watched as a massive plume of water erupted from inside of the bay. Ecstatic at the sight, crew members aboard Kasumi erupted into cheers of victory. One of their torpedoes had hit home. Whether a hit had actually been obtained is still a matter of debate. It's possible that the Japanese torpedo had randomly detonated without actually making contact with anything, or that what was actually observed was a group of shells from either Oyoto or Ashigara. What happened to that particular long-lance torpedo that night cannot be said with absolute certainty. Kasumi got the bearing to her targets first, and her salvo of torpedoes went into the water long before the other destroyers. Possibly due to a lack of targeting data, both Kashi and Kaya only managed to offload their torpedo salvos 20 minutes after Kasumi had already fired. 2 torpedoes were fired by each of the destroyers, but none made contact with their targets. Even with the lack of success from the torpedo attack, damage was still presumably being done by the Japanese cruisers. 6 and 8-inch shells had been almost constantly raining down around both the US ships and shore installations in San Jose. During this time, the Japanese line had been advancing parallel to the entrance to the anchorage, and had continued to move closer and closer to the Iling Strait. The 2 cruisers had switched to firing normal high explosive and armor-piercing projectiles, leaving the task of illumination to 2 of Ashigara's Aichi E-16A floatplanes, which were circling above the bay. However, despite the thorough illumination of the area, there were some crucial details that the Japanese missed. The 4 transports anchored inside San Jose had come under intense shelling by the Japanese forces from the start of the bombardment, but they proved to be very hard to hit. The 4 ships were anchored in such a way that their silhouette was masked by the shoreline of the anchorage, and the Japanese shells either came up short or landed far behind the vulnerable ships. Splinter damage was incurred from near misses, but very likely no shells actually made contact with the transports, and not a single one received anything like severe damage. The errant shells landed all over the beachhead, mostly detonating harmlessly on the soft sand and causing very little damage to any US emplacements. Despite all this, the gun crews aboard both Oyoro and Ashigara believed that the transports were suffering severely from their gunfire. Shells that exploded on land beyond the transports probably convinced the Japanese that they were scoring many hits. In addition, overinflated reports from the destroyer torpedo attack convinced the Japanese that all 4 transports had been sent to the bottom. In reality, pretty much every single one was unscathed. In all my time I've spent studying the IJN, I still have to consider this one of their most embarrassing failures. And to be blunt, it's not like I don't have options either. Thinking that the transport ships had all been sunk, the Japanese began looking for new targets. As the warships continued to advance, Ashigara's floatplanes began dropping flares over the Iling Strait, and targets were soon spotted. Inside the Iling Strait lay 2 prizes for the Japanese: the Liberty ship James H. Breasted and a supply dump at the mouth of the Kwasong River. With nothing to shield their silhouettes from the Japanese, they lay defenseless, like lambs ready for the slaughter. The Japanese ships targeted the supply dump first. Ashigara, Oyoro, Kasumi, and Asashimo all began raining shellfire on their target, zeroing in with deadly accuracy. Some of their shells went astray, but before long, the Japanese began to get the range. 8, 6, and 5-inch shells began landing around and inside of the supply dump, setting off everything from machine gun to mortar rounds, and wreaking havoc on everything in the vicinity. As the Japanese shells exploded, they set off a chain reaction. Hand grenades, fuel oil drums, artillery shells, and everything in between went up in a massive, catastrophic explosion. Shrapnel cut through the air in every direction, followed by massive metal fragments that tore through everything in sight, slicing into trees and spewing flame in every direction. US crew members on the nearby James H. Breasted were forced to duck for cover to avoid the burning remains of the supply dump. Since she was anchored so close by, the transport also suffered from the bombardment. Massive shell fragments managed to find their way toward the small ship, embedding themselves in her side and making a mess of her upper works. Watching from the bridge of Kasumi, Admiral Kimura must have marveled at the sight that lay before his eyes. The supply dump was in flames, belching black smoke and spewing flame in every direction. From his perspective, the destruction caused by the bombardment must have rendered a crushing blow to the Americans. It was a deceiving sight. Japanese damage estimates had never been particularly good during the war. During the Solomons campaign, Japanese skippers frequently reported the destruction of massive battleships during surface engagements, when in reality, nothing had been hit by them at all. The Japanese perfected a lot of things during the war, but never this. Over the course of the bombardment, Kimura had been told that the US landing beaches had been devastated by the cruiser fire, whilst destroyer torpedo attacks had sunk 4 valuable transport ships and their cargo. The reality of the situation was much different. The gunfire from the 2 Japanese cruisers had at first been wildly inaccurate. Most of their shells had landed harmlessly on the beach, doing nothing more than frighten the US troops ashore. The torpedo attack had gone much worse. Out of all the torpedoes the Japanese fired, not a single one had made contact with the US ships, and none of the transports had received damage from them. The only thing the Japanese had managed to do was destroy the US supply dump and mildly damage the James H. Breasted. From Kimura's perspective, there was nothing left for him to hit in the bay. Kimura ordered his ships to withdraw. The bombardment had come to a close. The Japanese ships began to turn around and withdraw from the bay, hoping to be clear of the area before the coming of dawn. As Ashigara ceased fire and began withdrawing, her floatplanes got a different idea. Her aircraft had thus far only dropped flares and provided fighter cover for the Japanese ships, but at this time, they decided to join in on the attack. A few of the aircraft were probably equipped with small bombs in case they spotted a target, and an opportunity for them was now in sight. The James H. Breasted, anchored in the Ealing Strait, had already received damage from the explosion of the supply dump. Now, with the dump in flames, she was clearly illuminated to the eyes of the Japanese pilots. The Japanese Aichi E-16A floatplane was a unique aircraft in that, unlike most floatplanes fielded by the IJN, it carried diving brakes that allowed it to operate as a proper dive bomber if ever needed. This was its main purpose for being carried on the Issei-class battle carriers, and now, the E-16As on Ashigara were finally going to fulfill their design mission. In possibly the only time this aircraft was actually used for a dive bombing attack, one of Ashigara's floatplanes began diving on the James H. Breasted. The bombs carried by these floatplanes were very small, only weighing around 200 pounds. Even multiple hits were rather unlikely to put a ship out of action by themselves. The odds of completely destroying James H. Breasted with this attack were incredibly slim. Somehow, the Japanese were going to defy those odds. By the power of nothing other than dumb luck, a bomb dropped by one of the E-16As managed to hit one of Breasted's most volatile cargoes, her gasoline. Splinter damage had already done heavy damage to the cargo ship, but nothing severe enough to put her in danger of sinking. However, now that situation was completely changed. Aboard Breasted, the explosion of the bomb was felt by crew members throughout the ship, but less immediately noticeable was what damage had been caused. Breasted was a cargo and troop ship, present off Mindoro to support the US landings by delivering both cargo and troops for the campaign. She had already landed 600 army troops before the attack, but for the most part her cargo was still aboard. It was just her luck that her load was incredibly dangerous, and the Japanese had managed to hit it. The Japanese bomb penetrated through Breasted's unarmored deck and landed amidst her cargo bays, detonating around her cargo of gasoline. Immediately, the gasoline drums were ruptured by the explosion, spewing the fuel oil all over her cargo bay. It quickly ignited. Within moments of the explosion, the ship's cargo areas were turned into a flaming mess, with gasoline spilling out of its drums and igniting left and right. Fires spread all throughout her cargo bays, feeding off anything it could find and choking the hallways with black smoke. Crew members aboard the ship rushed to enact some sort of damage control, but despite their efforts, Breasted was too far gone. As the fire began to consume the small ship, secondary explosions from her 4-inch magazines caused catastrophic damage to her hull and deck. Fuel vapor evaporating in closed spaces had a similar effect. The Japanese incursion into the bay had left the Breasted burning, and had successfully destroyed San Jose's supply dump, ridding the US Marines of many valuable resources needed for the invasion. By the time Breasted received her most severe damage, the Japanese had already left the scene. Ashigara, Oyoto, and the 5 remaining destroyers had ceased the attack by 12:04 p.m., and had quickly begun withdrawing from the area. The ships had to be on constant alert, as the possibility of a US counterattack was always present, so long as US torpedo boats were operating in the area. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, their ships were already being pursued. During the first stages of the bombardment of San Jose, the Japanese warships had targeted their shellfire towards what they knew was there. 4 cargo ships anchored inside of the bay. However, they weren't the only ships present. Multiple US PT boats were also using the bay as their home when the Japanese attacked, and after the bombardment ended, there was nothing stopping them from trying to enact some revenge. Notably present that night were USS PT-77, 221, and 223, all of which had inadvertently come under Japanese shellfire. Unlike most of the targets the Japanese fired at during this stage of the action, PT-77 had received splinter damage from either 6 or 8-inch shells, and by the time the Japanese had withdrawn, she was no longer fit for action. The same could not be said for the other two boats. Once the Japanese warships had withdrawn from the scene, PTs 221 and 223 brought their engines online and began chasing the Japanese formation. After the attack ended, the Japanese steamed back around Mindoro, going the exact same way that they had first come. Their goal now was to try and find the Kiyoshimo, which, unbeknownst to them, had hours earlier been abandoned after the air attack. If they could find the stricken ship, there was maybe a chance that they could save her. If not, then they might as well at least be given a window to rescue her survivors. It was a bit of a risky gambit. They were still sailing in waters infested by both USPT boats and night-flying aircraft. The Japanese ships would be forced to cut their engines during rescue operations to ensure they picked up all survivors. They could hardly put themselves in a more vulnerable position. Back in 1942, during the Solomons campaign, Japanese commanders often abandoned survivors to their own devices, prioritizing keeping their remaining ships away from American attack. Many officers and sailors during Operation Rei had a feeling that Kimura would do the same. However, the Japanese retreat had barely begun when Kimura sent a message to all the ships in his formation. The formation will now attempt to rescue the survivors from Kiyoshima. This was now their primary purpose. At 1 a.m. on December 27th, the Japanese formation reached the last known location of the destroyer. Eyes scanned the darkness for a sign of the stricken ship. Kimura himself watched with binoculars from the bridge of Kasumi. It didn't take long to realize that she was no longer there. The wounded destroyer had long since capsized from the effects of the air attack, and the only trace of her now were presumably her survivors, which were floating somewhere around the area. Not wanting to jeopardize his entire formation in a search for survivors that may well not exist, Kimura dispatched Asashimo and his own flagship Kasumi to look for the survivors. Breaking off from the main body, they began their search alone. Throughout this time, the two USPT boats had been steadily chugging along in the direction that the Japanese had last been seen. Crew members aboard the small boats remained at general quarters, all doing their duties as well as they possibly could have. For many aboard, this would be their only chance to attack a Japanese warship, and they intended to make the most of it. At 1:47 a.m., a crew member aboard Ashigara spotted the two small boats approaching in the distance. They were almost immediately identified to be hostile targets, and Ashigara went to action stations. The 8-inch guns on the heavy cruiser quickly began training toward the targets, and her gun crews began trying to get a range estimate on the approaching boats. By this point, the sighting had long since been transmitted to the rest of the Japanese formation, and the 6-inch guns aboard Oyoto also began zeroing down on the targets. If the US boats know that they've been detected, they didn't show any signs of it. After all, they had no reason to. They were doing precisely what USPT boats were designed to do. Ashigara and Oyoto opened fire at long range on the two US boats, shattering the silence of the night with their massive guns. Shell splashes rained down around the PT boats, but they still did not deviate their course. The two Japanese cruisers fired again, still unable to hit the small targets. Oyoto's guns rang out far more often than the slower and heavier guns on Ashigara, but their accuracy suffered. Before this operation, Oyoto's main battery had never before met with a surface enemy, and she was a novice in gunnery. Ashigara's story was much different. She was a veteran warship, and before this action, she had come into contact with USPT boats at the Battle of the Surigao Strait. Her gunnery was better, and her shells landed closer to the target. The Japanese ships continued firing until eventually, the USPT boats turned around and retreated back to San Jose, likely having finished their torpedo attack. The torpedoes that they probably fired were never spotted by the Japanese ships, and no damage was incurred. A few hours later, Asashimo and Kasumi returned from picking up survivors, carrying 259 of Kiyoshima's crew members between them. 81 were recorded as missing in action, although 5 would later be picked up by USPT boats. This was the effective end of Operation Rei-Ichi-Go. After rescuing Kiyoshima's survivors, the Japanese warships continued their retreat without seeing further contact with enemy forces. The Japanese would return to Camaran Bay in Indonesia, coming back home with tales of victory and reports of extensive damage caused to the enemy. Operation Rei-go had now officially come to an end. Once the operation came to a close, it was almost immediately hailed as a great victory by the rest of the Japanese Navy, and served as a serious morale booster to Japan's surface fleet, which, since the Battle of Leyte Gulf, had been seen with little more than scorn by the general public. On December 28th, around 2 days after the attack had been completed, an Imperial General Headquarters announcement was made to the Japanese public, stating, "The surprise attack on Mindoro by surface forces and air attacks has sunk 4 U.S. transports, 1 torpedo boat, 2 small boats, and destroyed enemy airfields and supply dumps with artillery fire, with 1 destroyer severely damaged on our side." It was a severe overstatement of what the Japanese had actually accomplished. In actuality, the Japanese naval forces had succeeded in damaging 2 torpedo boats, destroying an American supply dump, and sinking the cargo ship James H. Breasted, which, despite a valiant effort by her crew, was abandoned and burnt out by the gasoline fire. As referenced in the broadcast, an American airfield had been damaged, although this was due to aerial counterattacks by the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, and had little to do with the naval attack. In the end, total U.S. losses amounted to 1 cargo ship sunk, 2 PT boats damaged, and around 26 aircraft destroyed, along with the destruction of the supply dump and a temporary suspension of landing operations. For their part, the Japanese suffered the loss of the destroyer Kasumi, which foundered after a well-placed bomb hit, along with a few aircraft probably downed. Although the Japanese reported the action was rather exaggerated, in a bit of a shocking turn of events, it was nothing compared to what the Americans put out. On the 28th of December, a press release from MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area headquarters read, "General MacArthur reports today that the Japanese fleet lost 3 enemy destroyers, 1 battleship, and 1 cruiser when they set out Tuesday night in a futile attempt to destroy the well-established American positions on Mindoro Island." The Japanese naval force, consisting of 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, and 6 destroyers, bombarded American positions with highly inaccurate artillery fire, and their attempt to destroy American control over much of the South China Sea proved futile and costly. The enemy fleet was spotted approaching Mindoro at dusk, and U.S. Air Force bombers, fighters, and torpedo boats immediately launched an attack. Repeated sorties by our Air Force forced the enemy to retreat after some ineffective and inaccurate shelling of the coastline. 3 enemy destroyers were sunk, and 1 battleship and 1 cruiser were hit. In coordination with the Japanese naval attack, the enemy Air Force launched a light attack on our ground positions, but only caused minor damage, and 3 enemy planes were shot down. Aside from the details of the Japanese air attack, this press release was pretty blatantly skewed to paint the American side of the action in a better light. Where the claim that 3 enemy destroyers were sunk came from, I could not tell you. I feel like this is a bit of a rare case where the American side of the battle overclaims their victories. But hey, propaganda is propaganda, and the Japanese have most certainly done worse jobs of it. Operation Rei has pretty much been entirely forgotten in the Western world. In Japan, it's still often remembered today as the last organized victory of the Imperial Navy. I've seen some arguments online for the operation actually being an American victory, but those arguments mostly fall back on outdated or incorrect claims, and don't have much basis in modern research. At the end of the day, even if the Japanese failed to do as much damage as they hoped, their strategy in the operation was sound. Their main objective was to attack San Jose Anchorage, and even if the attack itself was a bit ineffective, it still occurred. Even if you don't consider Operation Rei to be a Japanese tactical victory, it was most definitely a strategic one, and in war, that's usually the one that counts. After the operation came to a close, the Japanese ships that participated in it went pretty quietly back to what they had been doing before. The Rei fleet was quickly disbanded, and all the ships were sent back to their respective divisions. Most of the warships were withdrawn to Japanese home waters at the outset of 1945, with High Command finally realizing that, aside from small-scale hit-and-run actions, the Japanese Navy was no longer an effective fighting force. After the operation, the ships that took part in it went their separate ways. Ashigara never returned to the home islands, and instead spent the rest of her life on transport runs in the Dutch East Indies. It was there that she would meet her fate at the hands of the British submarine Trenchant, which sank her on June 8, 1945. The 2 largest destroyers that survived the operation were Asashimo and Kimura's flagship, Kasumi. Both continued to serve with the Imperial Navy until late 1945. On April 7, 1945, the 2 destroyers accompanied the battleship Yamato on her suicide sortie to Okinawa. Both met their ends at the hands of U.S. carrier aircraft, whilst trying to protect the battleship. After being detached from Kimura's command, Oyoto returned to service with the Japanese carrier fleet. On the 10th of February 1945, she made the perilous return journey to Japanese home waters, carrying a valuable cargo of oil from the Dutch East Indies. She met her end along with the rest of the Japanese Navy, bombed helplessly by US aircraft in Kure Harbor, capsizing from the damage just 18 days before the war ended. Of the ships that participated in Operation Rei-go, only the three smallest, Kaya, Tsuji, and Kashi, survived the war. All were transferred out of the Japanese Navy by 1947 and were slowly scrapped after that point. Although Operation Rei-go was not the most glamorous operation ever undertaken by the Japanese Navy, and was definitely nowhere near their greatest success, it still stands testament to the fact that even so close to the end of the war, their navy was still capable of enacting some light revenge on US forces. In the end, although the Japanese Navy was losing ships left and right by the war's end, the bravery and skill of their ships' crews never diminished, and they still fought hard to the very end. With the ending of this video, I'm not trying to glorify the Japanese during the Second World War, or claim that their purpose for fighting was right and just, because, well, there's really no sensible person on this planet who would claim that. But in a lot of ways, they're like most other countries that came out on the losing side of a war. They may not have been the best, and they were essentially overrun and cut down by an enemy that they could no longer resist, but they still deserve respect, and their story always will deserve to be told. Hey y'all! Yeah, so it seems that you've reached the end of this video, and that means one of two things. Either you fell asleep with autoplay on, or you actually enjoyed this video. If it was the latter, I would really appreciate it if you drop a quick like on this video, and maybe even subscribe. Like I said earlier, it would help out the channel an absolute ton, and I'd really appreciate it. Anyway, with that said, I'd also like to give a quick shout out to some other small naval YouTubers in the scene right now. If you enjoyed this video, then you'll 100% enjoy their content as well. Maybe when you've got a little bit of free time, go check them out. I'm sure that they'd really appreciate it. Anyway, that's all I got. Cheers all.